George is certainly right about what we're inheriting. When I arrived at my desk on the very first day as Chief Secretary, I found a letter from the previous Chief Secretary to give me some advice on, I assumed, on how I could conduct myself over the months ahead. Unfortunately, when I opened it, it was a one-sentence letter which simply said, "Dear Chief Secretary, I'm afraid to tell you there's no money left," which was honest, but slightly less helpful advice than I had been expecting. But Nick, on your two direct questions, your first question was about the recommendations we've had so far and whether we sent any of those back. And the answer is yes, officials and departments are obviously very imaginative in looking at all of the potential range of cuts, and they put many cuts to us. But we have collectively, as a Treasury team, not as individuals, accepted many of those and rejected some that we think would not be acceptable, that would damage the services that we consider to be priorities. We've done that as a team, not as individuals. And on the second issue about, is this about dipping Liberal Democrat hands in the sort of blood of having to deal with this deficit? Well, in a sense, it is, but frankly, there is no way in which a coalition could be sustainable unless both partners in that accepted their responsibility to deal with the biggest challenge of the coalition, which is to get the deficit under control. I don't think that this coalition would last very long were there not a joint responsibility. But that joint responsibility also gives us an opportunity, and it's the opportunity to make sure that the key decisions that are taken are informed by Liberal Democrat values and policies of the type that we campaigned on, and many of which are contained in the coalition agreement, along with many Conservative policies. And so I see it as absolutely essential and in our party's interest, as well as the national interest, for the Liberal Democrats to be fully tied into the Treasury.
Channel 4 News. Could I just clarify, because you referred again to the 80-20 breakdown there of where the burden of deficit reduction is going to come from. It's not in the agreement, 80-20. It's blurred to main burden. Is that your understanding, 80-20, Chief Secretary, that's what you've signed up to? Sir Alan Budd, can I ask you, do you think that you'll have had a long time to think about this because you knew this job was probably coming down the line? Do you think the growth estimates of the last government were a work of fiction, as I think the Chancellor may have said in the past? And can I ask Chancellor and Chief Secretary, are you ready to be the most unpopular people in the country?
Well, first of all, I think the 80-20, I say it's a rule of thumb, and actually the language I used in the Financial Times this morning was exactly the same language I used as Shadow Chancellor. And I'm not saying it's exactly 80-20, I mean, that would be ridiculous. But I think it's a good rule of thumb, it's what the international evidence supports. And actually, with our bank levy, we are actually slightly over that, so it's more in the low 20s from 80-20. And maybe I'll just take. I don't think this is a question of popularity. What the government will do is provide an economy that works for everyone. And I think the British people are crying out for a government that is not driven by the 24-hour news headlines, that actually takes some decisions early on, and here we are in the first full week of this government, early on to do the right things, to take the right decisions, so that the economy is delivering prosperity for families across the country. And in the end, what's real unpopularity? It is taking short-term decisions that leave people high and dry, and that is what the last government did, and we are not going to repeat that mistake. David?
Yes, I mean, I obviously agree with that, and if you see the coalition agreement and the form of words that we used there, we make very clear that we believe that the main burden of deficit reduction should be borne by reduced spending, and that's a very similar pledge to the one that we made in our manifesto as well. What we have not tied ourselves into is an absolutely rigid formula, given that we both need to look very closely at the state of the public finances, informed by the work that Sir Alan Budd is going to do. But we're both committed to spending bearing the burden of deficit reduction.
Yes, well, I don't intend, I'm afraid, to say anything about forecasts, past or future, until we publish our forecast before the budget.
Nick.
From The Guardian. It's a question for the Chancellor and a question for the Chief Secretary. Chancellor, can I ask you, over the lifetime of this Parliament, can you give a commitment that you will accept every recommendation for a fiscal adjustment from the OBR? And if you can't give that commitment, will people not conclude that today you're not setting up the OBR, you're setting up the OBL, the Office for Blaming Labour? And a question for the Chief Secretary. A question for the Chief Secretary. You have today, in signing up to those 6 billion in-year cuts, obviously thrown away the central economic plank of your manifesto, which said that to have in-year cuts would threaten jobs and threaten recovery. It's one thing to throw away something like your immigration policy, but to throw away the central plank of your economic policy is quite a big deal. Can you explain why you did that? Was it because your policy was wrong, or because you just quite liked the cabinet seat?
Right. Oh, it's very spiky this morning. Let me explain how the Office for Budget Responsibility, will work, and maybe Alan will want to say more about this. First of all, it will produce the fiscal forecast and the growth forecast, and so, frankly, what previous chancellors have done is move those around a bit to try and fit their budget measures, and we are giving up that power. That is an enormous thing for a chancellor to give up. It is a key political tool in budget making, and I'm deliberately doing this because I don't think it produces good budgets. Another task it will have is to judge the success of the government against its own stated fiscal mandate. In other words, the path that I will set out in the budget about how much progress we expect to make in eliminating the structural budget deficit over the Parliament. The OBR will judge our success against that, so it won't be recommending particular tax or spending measures. What it will say is, you made this promise, Chancellor, and you are currently on track to deliver on that promise, or you are off track to deliver on that promise. And if you contrast that with Gordon Brown's golden rule, where he created this thing, then made himself his own judge and jury and said, I am meeting the golden rule. That was, a regular feature of those budgets in the middle part of this decade. That is not the right approach. So what you will get from the OBR is you will be able to say to me, well, it's all very well, George Osborne, you say you're delivering on your promise, but Alan Budd says you're not. And frankly, I think people in that situation are going to be more inclined to believe Alan Budd than they are George Osborne. David, do you want to?
Yes, I mean, Nick, you've presented this as implying that the main element of our economic policy was whether or not there should be a £6 billion in-year fiscal adjustment. I mean, if that was all we had to say about economic policy, we would have a serious problem. Our economic policy is much more than that. It's about getting the banks to lend again. It's about our tax policy. And it's about the long-term fiscal adjustment, where we were very clear that as soon as we were confident that the economy was growing again and that it was safe to start bringing down the deficit, we should do so. Actually, I think what's changed our mind is not only the compromises you have to make if you're working in a coalition, and let's be honest about that, both sides had to make compromises in the coalition arrangements, but also the clear advice that we have received from the Bank of England and the Treasury itself, that it would be responsible and safe to make this adjustment without risking the economic recovery which is currently underway and which we hope is slowly gaining ground. And secondly, to be frank, the circumstances in the markets over the last few months, where there has been a great degree of instability, where that has been contagious and spreading to other countries, and where there has been a real concern that if the United Kingdom didn't take early, clear, credible action, then some of that contagion could spread to these shores. And I think the action that we're now taking and that George has set out today will help to ensure that there is credibility in the new arrangements in the United Kingdom and will help to protect our economy from some of those pressures that are affecting other parts of the European Union and beyond.